Andy Hanauer with the One America movement. Thank you so much for being part of CEP and PACE's project to help complicate the narrative on bridging and division in America today. So honored that you're willing to spend some time with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. Why don't you start, give us 30 seconds on the One America movement, your mission, your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the One America movement is fighting what we call toxic polarization. We used to have to explain that to folks. Now it's just kind of everywhere. But it's this idea that polarization is normal. Division over issues is normal. It's healthy. But when it's toxic, it's really become something else. It's become about us versus them and identity. And we can't thrive if they're thriving. So we do that work in the religious community. We work with conservative evangelical Christians. We work with Muslims and Jewish communities. We both bring them together and we work in their communities to help them navigate these issues internally.
Great. So you mentioned division and toxic division in particular. How divided do you think we are as a country? Why does that division exist and how much of a problem is it really?
Yeah, it's a weird thing because in some ways we're less divided than we think, and in other ways we're worsely divided than we think. I don't know if worsely is a word, but we'll go with it. On the one hand, I think every bit of research we have shows that we are not as divided as we think on the actual issues. We're much less divided than we think on how much we dislike each other. We actually dislike each other less than we think we do, Democrats and Republicans. I think the problem is the nature of the division, right? Again, it is morphed from I don't agree with you on taxes or immigration or what have you, and become this sort of all-encompassing zero sum. Either your team wins or my team wins. And what we know is that the reason that's a problem is because when you get to that state, you don't stay here. These feedback loops start to push us farther and farther apart. And that's when you get to the point where you believe that if the other side won the election, it must be because they cheated or what have you, and you get an event like we had on January 6th. So I think it's really important that we understand that while we are actually less divided than we think we are, the nature of how we're divided is what's dangerous and what we need to work on.
So I know One America movement does a lot of work around bridging and bridging those divides, particularly since, as you mentioned, division begets division. So we don't have a tendency to naturally come together. We have a tendency to get even more divided. So when you think about bridging divides, what does bridging mean to you? How have you come to define or understand that as a concept? And conversely, what do you think others often misunderstand about bridging as a concept?
Yeah, so I think for us, bridging in this sense means reducing the toxicity. So if you have, to use our constituents, if you have a Southern Baptist church and a progressive reform synagogue, bridging doesn't mean believing that everyone in that church and everyone in that synagogue is going to agree on everything. They don't. They absolutely don't. But it means getting rid of the toxicity involved in what's keeping them apart. And that toxicity includes, misinformation. It includes misperceptions about who the other group is and what they believe. It includes the false belief that they don't have anything they can work together on or they don't have anything in common. So I think we think of bridging, I think too often as we're going to get the most extreme person here and the most extreme person here. We're going to bring them together and then we're going to put them on the nightly news for 30 seconds so people feel good about themselves. And I think that's a caricature. Those stories are important, but I think that what we really need to be doing is working with communities to move them away from the sort of toxicity and towards healthier perceptions and perspectives and behaviors.
And what does that do? In its best and highest form, what does removing that toxicity or turning down the temperature actually solve? And conversely, what can that not solve?
Yeah, so it's not going to solve different perspectives on issues like abortion or LGBT issues or the nature of God. what it is going to do is several things. Number one, I think it's going to make it more likely that we collaborate on things that matter to us in our local communities. It's going to make us more resilient to the garbage that comes at us from social media, from our national politics, from the sort of polarization industrial complex that makes money off of telling us how much to hate each other. And I think, as a person of faith myself, there's a spiritual component to this, which is that toxic polarization is bad for us as people. It makes us more fearful. It makes us more hateful. It makes us more smug. It makes us more assured that we are right about everything. And sometimes at One America, we ask people to just do the thought exercise of closing their eyes and saying out loud, everything I believe about the world is correct, and I am the smartest, most right person of all 7 billion people on Earth. And when you think about how absurd that is, it should at least get us to start to walk down that street of saying, maybe we could learn something from other people. Toxic polarization tells us everything we need to know we already have. We're right about everything. And all we need to do is just get better at making fun of, the other group.
What would you say to people who might be skeptical about bridging, about maybe where they're fair in their critiques or assessments? What kernel of truth is there in the pushback against bridging as a realistic or legitimate strategy?
Well, first of all, I think the people who care about bridging need to do a better job of talking about it. I mean, if you tell me that bridging means, or caring about polarization means, that we all just need to be civil to each other, or that we need to just get along, or be friends with someone who maybe believes that we're not human, of course people are going to have a negative reaction to that, and not only do I not blame them, I share it, right? So the idea that bridging runs counter to the idea that we need justice, I think is partly a product of failures on the part of people like me to adequately talk about it in a way that doesn't dismiss people's legitimate concerns. I think at the same time, there has to be, I think, clear communication also from people who care about this issue, about the effect that toxic polarization has on our ability to solve any problems in this country. We are getting so good at signaling our virtues through yard signs and social media posts. And I think we need to really challenge the idea that that's the equivalent of actually achieving justice. And if we really want to achieve justice, the question is, how do we get there? And I think that there's a lot to be said for the idea that we have more allies than we realize, and we're alienating them by not even understanding what they actually believe and who they are. And I think the last thing I'll say on this is, we also need to have, I think, an understanding of the just inherent tension, that there are issues that are black and white, right and wrong, and we're not always right about which ones fall in that category. So no, I'm not interested in the pro-racism argument. I also know that not everything I believe is black and white is probably black and white. And so how do we hold those two things sort of in truth at the same time? I think that's really hard. And I think understandably a lot of people have trouble with that.
You used the term earlier, polarization industrial complex. And one of the things that people who would say that we are also where you started, sometimes not as divided as we want to believe that we are, would say that a polarization industrial complex actually foments division, and lots of people stand to gain by convincing us that we are more divided than we are, or actually trying to divide us more than we are. What, for leaders and organizations that actually do belong to the industrial complex of polarization and are intentionally trying to divide us, or perhaps dividing us even unintentionally, what should we do about that? How should we think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's so many facets to this, right? I think first of all, there are, literally foreign entities that their entire goal is to divide Americans. And at the same time, I think it's really lazy and um, simplistic and even dangerous to say, well, it's the Russians' fault, right? We all need to come together except the Russians. They're bad. And I think that it also lets Americans off the hook for what we have created in our own country. I think that I have heard from people who work for advocacy organizations who say, yeah, we intentionally stretch the truth to make a case about this politician or that issue. We knew we were stretching the truth, but we knew that if we didn't do it, the other groups in our orbit would do it first and we would get left out. And so I think there's a huge amount of culpability that advocacy organizations have for not feeding that beast. I think a lot of it's unintentional. I think some of it is very much intentional. And I think that there needs to be not just one conversation about it, but there needs to be actual work done to address that. And I think if you're a person who works for one of those organizations, I would just say, hold yourself to the standards that you would hold others to, right? I mean, if something's not true, don't say it. And I think I would also challenge people in that position to ask themselves, are there allies that we could be reaching that we are instead alienating because it helps us raise money? And if that's the case, then maybe that's not the model that's going to change the world.
So if we solved toxic polarization, first of all, can it be solved? And second of all, if we could solve toxic polarization, what would be different about our country?
I thought we solved it last week. No? Okay. I guess I still have a job. If we solve toxic polarization, I think a few things would happen. We'd be less likely to shoot each other. I think our family lives would be more pleasant. And I think probably most importantly, actually, we'd actually be able to be better at solving problems. So I think, the one that strikes me the most is immigration. Whatever one's personal views are, I think there's a huge amount of reforms, policies that the vast majority of Americans agree on that don't happen because it is more profitable / sort of politically expedient to push extreme views. And I think that is ultimately something that does not serve the interests of most of the people in this country or the people who are immigrating into this country. I think it serves the sort of toxic polarization complex, right? So I think we would be better at solving problems that matter and actually achieving justice if we could get rid of this toxicity.
Whose work is that to do?
That's a great question. One America, we stay away from the word should. So we don't think it's our place to tell anyone that they should go have a conversation with this person or that person, or everybody's situation is different. Everyone's experiences are different. Some people, for very understandable reasons, don't feel able to engage people who have very different worldviews than they do in specific ways. We're never going to say should. I think at the same time, all people have an obligation to do the best they can to pursue truth and to pursue what is in the best interests of our entire society. And I think there's a huge element of toxic polarization that is fueled by indulgence. And by that, I mean, it is so easy to say what feels good on social media, and the consequences of it, that's someone else's thing to figure out. But I actually believe that we should hold ourselves, all of us should hold ourselves to high standards for how we behave towards others, even if the people who we view as our opponents don't always do that as well.
Appreciating that you said you are not a should organization, what would you encourage or hope that funders would understand about this work, and how might you encourage them to think about their role and their place in it, in this space?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question too. I think a few things. One is, this is not a game. Someone recently talked about this. It's not a game, it's a garden. And by that, I mean, this isn't something we're going to win this year or next year. It's about building a sort of ongoing resilience to the sort of toxicity. And that means it's long-term work. It's not always going to be the most exciting, most pressing thing on your agenda, but if we don't do it, we get what we've seen happen over the last couple of years. The second thing I would say is that people want shortcuts. They want an app. They want a Facebook policy change. They want an ad campaign that's going to reach 100 million people at the Super Bowl and somehow, depolarize them. But what the science and research shows is that the change comes mostly from trusted messengers delivering the right message to the right people. And that often looks like a small group leader, at an evangelical church. It looks like the old lady at coffee hour after Shabbat services, who everyone trusts, saying, I saw that Facebook post, young man, and I don't think you should say those things. And that sort of work takes relational trust. It takes patience, and it requires something different than sort of having the sleek new thing that you're going to put out there and magically change the world. And I think we need to make sure that that's embedded into our theory of how we make change on this issue.
Great. Any final thoughts? Anything I haven't asked that you think would be really helpful in complicating the narrative around bridging difference and civility in America right now?
Well, first of all, thanks for doing this. I think it's really important. I'm really grateful to PACE for being part of this, and I think it's really important that we complicate all sorts of narratives, right? I mean, it's part of what we have to do. And I think the irony is that bridge builders, for lack of a better term, can fall into the same trap of being their own bubble that we are accusing the country of being, right? We don't get better by being in echo chambers. We don't get stronger. We don't get smarter. We don't get more interesting. We become caricatures of ourselves. And I think all of us, including people who run organizations like ours, need to keep that in mind. Just challenge yourself, get out there, complicate things. I won't say should, but it'd be nice.
Great. Well, Andy, thank you so much for your time, your leadership, and your thoughtfulness in being part of this conversation.
Thanks, Kristen. Really appreciate it.